The first time I met Ethan Caldwell, he spilled coffee on my shoes and laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world. I was 24, broke, and hustling as a barista in a Brooklyn cafe, dreaming of a life beyond steaming milk and wiping counters. Little did I know, that clumsy, blue-eyed stranger would unravel my world in ways I never imagined. My name is Javier Torres, and I'm not the kind of guy who believes in fairy tales. Growing up in a cramped apartment in the Bronx with my mom and 3 sisters, I learned early that love is a luxury, not a guarantee. At 24, I'm scrappy, with a quick wit and a knack for surviving on charm and grit. My brown eyes and curly hair get me tips at the cafe, but my dreams of becoming a graphic novelist keep me up at night, sketching stories no one's read yet. Ethan, on the other hand, was born with a silver spoon so shiny it could blind you. At 25, he's the only son of Richard Caldwell, a real estate tycoon whose name is plastered on half the skyscrapers in Manhattan. Ethan's got this effortless charisma, tousled dark hair, a lopsided grin, and a laugh that makes you feel like you're in on a secret. But behind those sparkling blue eyes, there's a restlessness, like he's searching for something his father's millions can't buy. It was a humid August morning when Richard Caldwell himself walked into my cafe. He was all sharp suits and sharper eyes, a man who owned every room he entered. I didn't know who he was at first, just another rich guy demanding a latte with an impossible list of specifications. But when he slid a business card across the counter with a handwritten note, "Meet me at 7 p.m. The Waldorf Astoria. Important. I knew something was up. I showed up, half expecting a scam. The Waldorf's lobby was a world away from my reality. Chandeliers dripping with crystal, marble floors that echoed my nervous footsteps. Richard was waiting in a private lounge, sipping scotch like it was water. He didn't waste time. "I need you to date my son," he said, his voice low and commanding. "Ethan's lost. He's reckless, partying too much, embarrassing the family. I want someone grounded, someone like you, to keep him in line." I laughed, thinking it was a joke. "You want me to babysit your grown son?" "Not babysit," Richard corrected, leaning forward. "Date him. Make him believe it's real. I've seen you, Javier. You're charming, relatable. You're exactly what he needs to settle down." "And what's in it for me?" I asked, my heart pounding. $10,000 a month, he said, sliding an envelope across the table. "Plus, I'll fund your little comic book hobby. A studio, supplies, whatever you need." I stared at the envelope, my mind racing. 10 grand a month could change everything. Pay off my mom's medical bills, get my sisters through college, give me a shot at my dreams. But pretending to date some spoiled rich kid? That felt like selling my soul. "Why me?" I asked. Richard's eyes softened, just for a second. "Because you're real, Javier. Ethan needs someone real." I took the deal not because I wanted to, but because I had to. That night, I lay awake, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. I didn't know Ethan yet, but I knew one thing. Faking love with a stranger was going to be the hardest job I'd ever taken. The next day, I bumped into Ethan at a rooftop bar in Soho, just as Richard had arranged. He was leaning against the railing, a drink in hand, looking like he'd stepped out of a magazine. I played my part. Charming, a little flirty, dropping hints about my art to spark his interest. To my surprise, Ethan was easy to talk to. He laughed at my jokes, asked about my sketches, and didn't flinch when I mentioned growing up in the Bronx. By the end of the night, he was the one suggesting we grab dinner the next day. For weeks, I played the role of the perfect boyfriend. We went to art galleries, shared late-night pizza in Washington Square Park, and texted until 2 a.m. Ethan was reckless, sure, dragging me to underground clubs, sneaking us into VIP sections, but he was also kind, curious, and surprisingly vulnerable. He told me about his mom, who left when he was a kid, and his dad, who controlled every part of his life. I started to see the cracks in his perfect world, and it made me feel something. But every time I laughed at his jokes or held his hand, guilt gnawed at me. This was a job, not a romance. I was lying to him, and the deeper we got, the worse it felt. Richard checked in weekly, demanding updates, watching us like a hawk. He'd show up unannounced at restaurants, his eyes narrowing as he studied us. I told myself it was just business, but Ethan's smile was starting to make me forget that. One night in Central Park, everything changed. We were walking under the stars, the city's hum fading into the background. Ethan stopped by a fountain, his face lit by the moonlight. "Javier," he said, his voice soft, "why do I feel like you're the only real thing in my life?" My heart stopped. I wanted to tell him the truth, to confess that his dad was paying me to be here. But before I could speak, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't part of the plan, it was raw, electric, real. My hands found his face, and for a moment, I forgot about the money, the deal, everything. That's when I heard the rustle of leaves. I pulled back, my eyes darting to the shadows. Richard was there, watching us, his face unreadable. My stomach dropped. This wasn't part of the script. Something in his eyes told me everything was about to shift. The kiss lingered on my lips like a secret I wasn't supposed to keep. Ethan's breath was still warm against my cheek as I glanced back at the shadows where Richard stood, his silhouette rigid against the park's soft glow. I wanted to run, to explain, to do anything but face the weight of his stare. But Ethan grabbed my hand, oblivious, pulling me toward the fountain with a grin. "Javier, you okay?" he asked, his voice light but his eyes searching. At 25, Ethan had a way of reading people, like he could sense the storm brewing inside me. His dark hair fell into his face, and he brushed it away, waiting for an answer. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile, just caught up in the moment. Inside, my mind was a hurricane. Richard's presence wasn't a coincidence. He'd been tracking us, probably since the beginning. The deal was supposed to be simple. Play the boyfriend, keep Ethan out of trouble, cash the checks. But that kiss wasn't fake, and the way my heart raced when Ethan looked at me wasn't part of the contract. I was in too deep, and Richard's watchful eyes meant he knew it. The next morning, I found a text from Richard. "Meet me at my office. 9 a.m. sharp. No pleasantries, no explanation." I dragged myself to his glass tower in Midtown, my stomach twisting as I rode the elevator to the 50th floor. Richard's office was a shrine to his power. Floor-to-ceiling windows, mahogany desk, a view of Manhattan that screamed untouchable. He didn't look up from his papers when I walked in. "You're getting too close," he said, his voice like ice. "This is a job, Javier. Don't forget that." I swallowed hard, my hands clenching in my lap. "I'm doing what you asked. Ethan's staying out of trouble. He's happy." Richard's eyes snapped to mine, sharp and unyielding. "Happy?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I didn't pay you to make him happy. I paid you to keep him in line. That kiss last night, don't let it happen again." My throat tightened. "You saw that." "I see everything," he said, standing to pace the room. "Ethan's my son. I know what's best for him. You're a means to an end, nothing more." The words stung, but I couldn't argue. I'd taken his money, agreed to his terms. But every moment with Ethan, The late-night talks, the way he laughed at my terrible dance moves, the warmth of his hand in mine, felt more real than anything in my life. I wasn't just playing a role anymore, and that terrified me. "Keep your distance," Richard warned, "or I'll find someone else who can." I left his office with a check for 10 grand and a heart full of dread. I wanted to tell Ethan everything, to come clean and beg for forgiveness, but the thought of losing him, of losing the only person who saw me as more than a broke kid from the Bronx, kept me silent. That night, Ethan invited me to a gallery opening in Chelsea. He was waiting outside, dressed in a tailored blazer that made his blue eyes pop. At 25, he carried himself with a confidence that masked his insecurities, but I'd started to see through it. He lit up when he saw me, pulling me into a hug that felt too good to be fake. "Javi, you're gonna love this," he said, dragging me inside. The gallery was packed with artists, collectors, and pretentious types sipping overpriced wine. Ethan moved through the crowd like he owned it, but his hand never left mine. We stopped in front of a painting, a chaotic swirl of colors that somehow felt like us. "What do you see in it?" he asked, his voice soft. I hesitated, then said, "It's messy, but it's beautiful, like it's trying to figure itself out." He looked at me, his eyes softening. "Kinda like you, huh?" My heart skipped. I wanted to kiss him again, to tell him he was the only real thing in my world. But Richard's warning echoed in my head, and I pulled back, forcing a laugh. "You're such a sap, Caldwell." The night went on, and so did the act. We danced around the truth, flirting and laughing like nothing was wrong. But every time Ethan's hand brushed mine, I felt the weight of the lie. I was falling for him hard, and every moment we spent together made it harder to pretend. A week later, things took a turn. Ethan showed up at my apartment unannounced, his face pale and his hands shaking. At 25, he was usually unshakable, but now he looked like a kid who'd just lost something precious. "Javi, I need to tell you something," he said, stepping inside my tiny studio. The place was a mess. Sketchbooks scattered, dishes in the sink, but he didn't care. He sat on my couch, running a hand through his hair. "My dad, he's trying to control me again. He wants me to take over part of his company, move to London, leave New York behind." My stomach dropped. "What did you say?" "I told him no," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I told him I'm happy here, with you." The air left the room. I wanted to scream that this wasn't real, that I was a fraud, but the way he looked at me, like I was his anchor, stopped me cold. Instead, I sat beside him, my hand finding his. "Ethan, you don't have to do what he wants. You're your own person." He leaned into me, his head resting on my shoulder. "I know, but it's hard when he's always watching." I froze. Did Ethan know? Had Richard said something? My heart raced, but before I could ask, Ethan's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his face darkening. "It's him. He wants to meet both of us." The restaurant was one of those places where the menu didn't list prices, and the waiters moved like they were auditioning for a silent film. Richard had chosen it, of course, a midtown steakhouse with dark wood and leather booths, the kind of place that screamed power. Ethan and I sat across from him, our hands brushing under the table, a secret defiance against the man who controlled our lives. At 24, I'd faced plenty of intimidating moments, but sitting under Richard Caldwell's gaze felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. His gray eyes flicked between us, calculating, as if he could see every lie I'd told. Ethan, at 25, was tense, his usual charm replaced by a quiet defiance. His dark hair was messier than usual, like he'd been running his hands through it all day. "Ethan," Richard began, cutting into his steak with surgical precision, "we need to discuss your future. This lifestyle of yours isn't sustainable." Ethan's jaw tightened. "My lifestyle? You mean living my life instead of yours?" I squeezed his hand under the table, my heart pounding. Richard's eyes darted to me, and I felt the weight of his warning from the office. "Keep your distance." But Ethan's hand in mine felt like the only thing keeping me grounded. "Javier," Richard said, his voice deceptively calm, "you've done a fine job keeping Ethan occupied, but it's time to focus on what's best for him. He needs structure, responsibility, a role in the company." I opened my mouth to speak, but Ethan cut in. "I'm not your puppet, Dad. I'm not moving to London. I'm happy here with Javi." Richard's fork paused midair. "Happy?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. "You think this is happiness? Running around with some barista? Wasting your potential?" The word barista hit like a slap. I felt Ethan tense beside me, his hand tightening around mine. "Don't talk about him like that," he said, his voice low but fierce. "Javi's more real than anyone you've ever paid to be in my life." My stomach twisted. Did Ethan suspect something? I forced myself to stay calm, but Richard's eyes were locked on me, like he was daring me to break. "Ethan," he said, leaning back, "you're young. You don't understand what's at stake. Javier, tell him." The room seemed to shrink. Ethan turned to me, his blue eyes searching, trusting. I wanted to confess everything, to tell him I'd been paid to be here, that his father had orchestrated it all. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I said, "Ethan, you should do what feels right for you, not what anyone else wants." Richard's lips twitched, a flicker of approval or amusement. I couldn't tell. But Ethan smiled, his shoulders relaxing. "See, Dad? Javi gets it." The rest of the dinner was a blur of tension and forced small talk. Richard watched us like a predator, and I felt the walls closing in. When we finally left, Ethan pulled me into an alley outside the restaurant, his hands cupping my face. "Thank you," he whispered, his lips brushing mine, "for standing up for me." I kissed him back, my heart breaking. Every touch, every word, was tainted by the lie I was living. I wanted to be the person Ethan thought I was, but I was drowning in guilt. The next few weeks were a tightrope walk. Ethan and I grew closer, our days filled with stolen moments. Sketching together in my apartment, dancing in the rain on a Brooklyn street, sharing secrets under the stars. At 24, I'd never felt this way about anyone, and it scared me. Ethan, at 25, was opening up more, telling me about his dreams of starting a nonprofit, of escaping his father's shadow. But every time we kissed, I saw Richard's face in the shadows, watching, judging. Then came the night that broke me. We were at a rooftop party in Williamsburg, the city skyline glittering below. Ethan was laughing, his arm around my waist, when I got a text from Richard. "You're crossing the line. End it or I will." My hands shook as I stared at the screen. Ethan noticed, his brow furrowing. "Javi, what's wrong?" "Nothing," I lied, shoving my phone in my pocket. But the truth was clawing at me, begging to be let out. I couldn't keep doing this. Not to him, not to myself. That night, as we lay in my bed, Ethan's head on my chest, I made a decision. I had to tell him, even if it meant losing him. The next morning, I asked Ethan to meet me at Central Park, by the same fountain where we'd kissed. My heart was in my throat as I walked through the autumn leaves, my sketchbook tucked under my arm. I'd drawn something for him, a comic strip of us, our story, the truth. It was my way of confessing, of showing him who I really was. He was waiting for me, his blue eyes bright against the golden leaves. At 25, he looked invincible, but I knew he was as fragile as I was. "Javi," he said, grinning. "What's with the serious face?" I took a deep breath, holding out the sketchbook. "Ethan, there's something you need to know." Before I could say more, a black SUV pulled up nearby. Richard stepped out, his face a mask of cold fury. My heart sank. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not now. "Javier," Richard said, his voice cutting through the air. "It's time to stop this charade." Ethan's face went pale, his eyes darting between me and his father. At 25, he was used to Richard's controlling nature, but the raw anger in his father's voice was something else. I stood frozen, the sketchbook heavy in my hands, my confession stuck in my throat. At 24, I'd faced tough moments, but this, standing between the man I was falling for and the man who'd paid me to betray him, was a nightmare I couldn't escape. "What's he talking about, Javi?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. His blue eyes searched mine, pleading for an explanation that wouldn't break him. Richard stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "Tell him, Javier. Tell him why you're really here." My mouth went dry. The park around us, families laughing, leaves rustling, felt like a cruel contrast to the storm brewing. I wanted to run, to disappear, but Ethan deserved the truth. I opened the sketchbook, my hands shaking, and handed it to him. "Ethan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "your dad, he hired me to date you, to keep you out of trouble." The words hung in the air like a guillotine. Ethan's face crumpled, his fingers tightening around the sketchbook. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages I'd poured my heart into. A comic strip of us, from the coffee spill to the kiss, ending with me confessing the deal. The final panel showed me, alone with the words, "I'm sorry. I fell for you anyway." You were paid?" Ethan's voice cracked, his eyes wet with betrayal. "This whole time, it was fake?" "No," I said, stepping toward him. "It started that way, but it's real now." "Ethan, Stop." He cut me off, his hand raised. "Don't. Just don't." He turned to Richard, his voice shaking with rage. "You did this? You paid someone to manipulate me?" Richard didn't flinch. "I did what was necessary. You were spiraling, Ethan. I needed to protect you." "Protect me?" Ethan laughed, bitter and broken. "You've been controlling me my whole life. This is a new low, even for you." I stood there, helpless, as Ethan tossed the sketchbook to the ground. The pages fluttered open, my drawings exposed to the wind. "Javi," he said, his voice barely audible, "I trusted you." He walked away, his shoulders hunched, disappearing into the park's crowd. I wanted to chase him, to beg him to listen, but Richard's hand clamped onto my arm. "You've done enough," he said coldly. "Go home, Javier. You're done." I yanked my arm free, my chest tight with anger and guilt. "You don't get to decide that," I snapped. "You don't get to play God with his life or mine." Richard's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond. He turned and walked back to his SUV, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my choices. For days I tried to reach Ethan. Texts, calls, voicemails, all unanswered. At 24, I'd never felt so lost. My apartment felt emptier than ever. My sketchbook's a reminder of the story I'd ruined. I stopped going to the cafe, stopped drawing, stopped everything. The 10 grand checks kept coming, but I didn't cash them. They felt like blood money. A week later, I was sitting on my fire escape, staring at the city, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ethan. Meet me at the gallery. 8 p.m. My heart leapt, but dread followed. Was he giving me a chance? Or was this goodbye? The Chelsea gallery was quiet, the same one we'd visited weeks ago. Ethan was standing in front of the chaotic painting, his hands in his pockets. At 25, he looked tired, his blue eyes dulled by hurt. I approached slowly, my heart in my throat. Ethan, I started. I'm so sorry. I never meant to. He held up a hand, silencing me. I read your comic, he said, his voice steady but heavy. Every page. You could have lied to me forever, but you didn't. Why? I swallowed hard, my eyes burning. Because I love you, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I didn't mean to, but I do. And I couldn't keep lying to you. Ethan's eyes softened, but the pain was still there. I want to believe you, he said. But how do I know what's real anymore? I stepped closer, desperate to bridge the gap. This is real, I said, my voice breaking. Every moment we spent together, every laugh, every kiss, it was real. I'll spend the rest of my life proving it if you let me. He didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at the painting. Finally, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. I need time, Javi. I need to figure out who I am without my dad's shadow, or yours. I nodded, my heart aching but understanding. Take all the time you need, I said. I'll be here. He left the gallery, and I stood there, surrounded by art but feeling like I'd lost the only masterpiece that mattered. Months passed and New York moved on without us. At 24, I threw myself into my art, channeling my pain into a graphic novel about love, betrayal, and redemption. The pages were raw, honest, a mirror of my heart. I didn't hear from Ethan, but I didn't stop hoping. Every sketch, every line was for him. One spring evening, I was at a small comic convention in Brooklyn, showcasing my work. My booth was modest, just a table with my graphic novel and a few prints. At 24, I was starting to believe in myself, even if the world hadn't caught up yet. The crowd was thin, but I didn't care. I was telling my story. Then I saw him. Ethan, at 25, stood at the edge of my booth, his blue eyes brighter than I remembered. He was holding a copy of my graphic novel, his fingers tracing the cover, a drawing of us under the Central Park stars. Javi, he said, his voice soft but steady. This is incredible. My heart raced, but I kept my cool. Thanks, I said, my voice catching. It's kind of our story. He smiled, a real smile, the kind that lit up his whole face. I know, he said. I read it. All of it. We stood there, the convention buzzing around us, but it felt like we were the only two people in the world. Ethan, I said, stepping closer. I meant every word. I'm sorry for how it started, but I'm not sorry for loving you. He looked at me, his eyes searching, and then he laughed. A soft, broken sound. You're still a sap, he said, but there was warmth in his voice. I've been figuring things out, Javi. I moved out of my dad's place, started working with a nonprofit. I'm trying to be my own person. I nodded, pride swelling in my chest. You're doing it, I said. You're already more than his shadow. He stepped closer, his hand brushing mine. And you, he said, you're still the realest thing in my life. My breath caught. Does that mean? It means I'm willing to try, he said, his voice low. No deals, no lies. Just us. I grinned, my heart soaring. Just us, I echoed. We didn't kiss, not yet, but we walked out of the convention together, our shoulders brushing, the city alive around us. Richard had tried to control us, to shape our story, but we were writing our own ending. One where love wasn't a transaction, but a choice. As we stepped into the Brooklyn night, Ethan took my hand, his fingers warm and sure. At 24 and 25, we were two kids from different worlds, but we'd found something worth fighting for. The stars above us felt like a promise, and for the first time, I believed in fairy tales.